Hello everyone, I'm Simon Adams, President and CEO of the Center for Victims of Torture. We're honored to have you all join us today for Guantanamo Uncovered, a conversation with the New York Times Serial podcast. And I must say, as someone who has obsessively listened to every season of Serial, it's an honor to welcome you to this event that we are filming here live in New York City. And I know that in the crowd here tonight, both online and in the room with us here, are people who are long-term supporters of CVT and folks who are new to CVT. So welcome to all of you. 40 years ago, CVT began in a house on the edge of a university campus in Minneapolis. And it was formed to provide direct clinical services and care to those who have experienced torture. And we had one therapist in 1985. Since then, CVT has grown to become a global human rights and humanitarian organization with offices in Kenya, Ethiopia, Jordan, Uganda, across the United States of America, and more than 500 staff worldwide. But over the decades, the core mission has remained the same: to heal the wounds of torture for individuals, families, and communities, and to end the use of torture worldwide. Every year, we serve about 20,000 refugees and asylum seekers who are survivors of torture and other extreme trauma. And our policy advocacy work is also an important part of trying to bend the arc of history and build a world free from torture, and to hold those who commit torture accountable for their actions. And as everyone in this room and online is painfully aware, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, which were perpetrated just a few kilometers from where I'm standing here, the US government embraced torture and indefinite detention at Guantanamo. And so for 2 decades, CVT has advocated to close Guantanamo and to end this dark chapter in this country's history. We were therefore thrilled that Serial, which has won every podcasting award available, decided to address Guantanamo in season 3, and we were proud to lend them our expertise and our opinions whenever they asked for them, and probably sometimes when they didn't ask for them. And you'll hear more about that during tonight's discussion. And this is a topic about which many of us, including myself, have very strong feelings. For example, if I could digress for one moment, my family comes from Belfast in Northern Ireland. And during the 1970s, 2 of my relatives and a number of other people from the community that my family comes from were interned by the British Army and subjected to indefinite detention. One of my uncles, by marriage, was only 17 when he was interned in 1971 and was subjected to interrogation methods that the British later packaged together and called the 5 techniques. Now, the 5 techniques were prolonged stress positioning, hooding, subjection to noise, sleep deprivation, deprivation of food and drink, plus beatings, but the beatings weren't enumerated. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This particular relative didn't get all 5 techniques inflicted upon him, but he did experience 4 of them, and they also threw in a bonus one, mock execution. In his case, that involved being hooded and thrown from a helicopter. In 1976, the Irish government took the British government to the European Court of Human Rights over the 5 techniques and the treatment of 14 detainees who they called the hooded men. And the European Court ruled that even though this treatment was inhuman and degrading and clearly violated the men's human rights, they did not, in their learned opinion, consider that it had amounted to torture. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. Why are we talking about Northern Ireland? We're here to talk about Guantanamo. Because in the aftermath of 9/11, the US government went looking for rationalizations for a system of institutional cruelty that they were about to implement. And the European Court's ruling about the 5 techniques was cited by the US government as providing legal justification for what they were now calling enhanced interrogation. They even copied some of the same techniques. And this matters because in the same way that the US examined and learned from the British experience in Northern Ireland, other states have studied Guantanamo. For governments who routinely violate human rights. Guantanamo and enhanced interrogation are a blueprint for how to get away with torture and indefinite detention. For us, Guantanamo is a warning. For them, it's an instruction manual. It teaches them how to justify the unjustifiable, how to excuse the inexcusable. And that's why the legacy with Guantanamo will be with us long after the razor wire rusts away and the physical prison is gone. So, one final thing before we begin, a warning and a disclaimer. This can be a disturbing subject. Some of the content we'll be covering tonight will include descriptions of torture, either by the speakers or from audio clips. Please be warned, everybody. I'd also like to call attention, for those who are online, to the chat box on the right side of the screen. I think I got that right. I invite our online audience to engage with us in the chat. We'll be selecting questions towards the end of the program for our panelists to answer, and there's also questions going around this room as well. And now I would like to introduce Scott Ream, CVT's Director of Global Policy and Advocacy, who will be the Chief Navigator and Designated Helmsman for the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Wait.
Take it back.
Yeah, I don't think of it. Simon, thanks for the generous intro. I'm Scott Ream, as Simon said, CVT's Director of Global Policy and Advocacy. I want to just say two things at the top before we get started. The first is to echo Simon's profound thanks to the entire Serial team. As a human rights community, we can reach a lot of people. We cannot ever reach as many people as you all can. This is a subject, as you well know, I think as you all who don't know as much about Guantanamo will hear throughout the night, is sort of critical to really understand, to appreciate how bad it is, what's happening there historically and today. So thank you. And the second is sort of more on a personal note. I've been at this for about 15 years. It is a very surreal time to be having this conversation, which I guess is appropriate because everything about Guantanamo is surreal. But as the Biden administration leaves office and a flurry of efforts it's making to close the place, and at the same time taking other steps that are going to mean it stays open, when President Trump and his administration comes in, and their policy is to keep it open. It's frustrating work, it's hard work, both in a sort of substantive sense and emotionally. And I feel really lucky to be able to do it with an absolutely tremendous community of people. And I want to acknowledge them in particular because I know a bunch of those folks are listening online, some are here in the room. It's supportive, determined, smart, caring. I know I couldn't keep doing this work without them. I know some of my colleagues feel the same. And I want to specifically mention a group called September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. They are a subject of one of the episodes of the podcast. We'll talk about that more tonight. It's an organization that was created by family members who lost loved ones on 9/11, and their central focus is to try to make the US government respond in its counterterrorism efforts humanely, lawfully, justly, and when it comes to Guantanamo more specifically, to try to get some kind of fair and even-handed justice for the crimes that were committed on 9/11. They have been doing this since 9/11, and there's been precious little sort of advancement on either of those fronts. Several of them are at Guantanamo right now. They are internet permitting, which is always a question at Guantanamo. They were going to join this event, and I just want to say, Colleen and Terry, if you guys are watching right now, love you very much. One of the fabulous colleagues I just referenced internally at CVT, I'm going to turn it over to introduce herself now, Allie Beckman.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Allie Beckman. My title is Senior Clinician for External Relations. Scott is actually my boss. I'm with the Policy and Advocacy team. I've been with CVT now for 25 years, and actually for the bulk of that, and my training is as a psychotherapist. So I have worked directly with torture survivors for over 20 years providing psychotherapy services. And my role with this whole thing and with Guantanamo has largely been in the background and a supportive one. I have provided training and consultation to defense attorneys who are working with the men who are currently still at Guantanamo. I have also provided training and consultation with this is such a long title, and I worked really hard to memorize it. Let's see if I got it. The former UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights. That's her whole title. I got it. Provided training and consultation to them because they went and interviewed the men. And with the Serial folks, we talked on several occasions, particularly surrounding the dynamics of torture and how it impacts people, and also did some talking about how to prepare for interviewing a survivor. So that's sort of my piece.
Thanks, Allie. To my left, Dana Chivvis, who was the co-host of season 4 of Serial, and her colleague Jessica Weisberg, who's a senior producer for Serial. I think, as Simon said, there's probably more people who know a lot about Serial in the room than know a lot about Guantanamo, but just so kind of we're all on the same page, could you just give a little background on the podcast?
Sure. So Serial production started in 2014 as an offshoot of This American Life. It started as just one podcast called Serial. And then over the last years, it's grown into a whole company. And our shows range from shows about Guantanamo to our latest show, which was called The Good Whale, which is about the rewilding of the whale who you may have seen in Free Willy. So our shows have a wide range of topics, but they all sort of feature interesting people and surprising moments, really grappling with what it means to be a person, or I guess in The Good Whale, what it means to be a whale. But yeah, we pride ourselves on doing documentary stories that sort of feel like a movie, even though you're listening to them.
Great, thank you. Just to level set anyone, I'm going to do about a minute and a half on background of Guantanamo, and then we were going to jump into the podcast and some of the themes throughout. So several weeks after the 9/11 attacks, I think as everyone remembers, the U.S. went to war in Afghanistan, intending to target Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, so that is those responsible for 9/11 and those that harbored them. In January the following year, January 11th, so 23 years ago Saturday, the U.S. opened Guantanamo, a detention facility on a remote island in Cuba on a U.S. military base. So there were three main rationale behind Guantanamo. The first was the U.S. wanted a place to hold people, right? People that it was sweeping up on the battlefield in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And it wanted to hold them for whatever duration of time it wanted to hold them. Second, it wanted a place to interrogate them, and similarly to interrogate them in essentially whatever way they wanted to interrogate them. The theory being that people they had were people who were either responsible for 9/11, knew something about the responsibility for 9/11, or had information on future plots against the US. And the third, to facilitate the first two, right, they picked this remote island in Cuba in the hope that it would be outside of both domestic and international law. It was actually referred to, the choice to pick Guantanamo was referred to by several Bush administration officials as hoping it would be the legal equivalent of outer space. And actually there's more space law in 2024 now than there probably is at Guantanamo, but there certainly wasn't much at the time. About 780 men and boys have passed through Guantanamo over the years, all Muslim, not the group that the US thought or claimed it had, mostly foot soldiers picked up on the battlefield, people that Afghan warlords and others sold to the US for a $5,000 bounty, people just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was also, though this was never a priority, a war court system set up at Guantanamo to theoretically prosecute people who had committed crimes. That system purported to be a mix of the US military justice system and federal courts. In reality, it was those two things with gaping holes, and the gaping holes were where all the defendants' core rights live. So it is a system that acknowledged that if people were going to be prosecuted, it was going to be on the basis of very thin, often not credible evidence, and in particular, evidence produced by torture. And we'll talk more about that system in a little bit as well. President Bush eventually decided that he wanted to close Guantanamo. He transferred about 530 some odd people out. President Obama obviously campaigned on this. It was a priority of his administration. He transferred out about 200. President Trump won. And the Biden administration, at least as of when I turned my phone off tonight, 25. And so it's now 15 men left. And the last thing I'll say is the men who are alleged to be most responsible for 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 others, have been on trial for that crime for 17 years in this military commission system. It was first charged in 2008. Tomorrow, KSM was supposed to plead guilty in the commissions in a deal reached between the defendants and the prosecution. An hour ago, a federal court in Washington, at the request of senior officials of the Biden administration, stopped that. So it will not happen tomorrow. Whether it happens at all now remains to be seen. So with that background, Dina, why did you all choose to...
That was very efficient.
Why did you all choose this as a topic for Serial to cover?
So we got initially interested in Guantanamo, I guess, for the injustice of it, which I think Sarah had done some reporting on. Sarah Koenig, my co-host and our colleague at Serial, had done some reporting for This American Life in like 2006 or something. She'd done a story on Guantanamo, and it's just sort of like stuck in her head. And I think the fact of like this like injustice is right there, and it's sitting right there offshore of the United States, and we all kind of just got used to it and decided that was okay, was sort of a shocking idea to us. So that was sort of like the initial reason, and we, a little background, we did, season 1 of Serial was on a, it's probably the one most people would know of, was on a murder case in Baltimore. And when we finished that season, we thought like, oh, we'll go do a season on Guantanamo. This was 2015. And it was sort of the last years of the Obama administration, and we were interested to see like, how are they gonna close it? And so we went the first time to Guantanamo in 2015, thinking it would be season 2 of Serial. And basically we couldn't do it then because nobody would talk to us on the record. But we went, and we were sort of like taken by the weirdness of the place. And for me personally, like the weirdness, which I know is something we're gonna talk about in a minute, was editorially and narratively interesting to me, in addition to like, okay, well, the injustice part is still like sitting there. This place is still chugging along. So so we put it aside in 2015. We did a season with Jess on Bo Bergdahl, an American soldier who went missing in Afghanistan. And eventually we just kept coming back to it. Like Sarah and I wrote a TV pilot, like a fictionalized TV show about Guantanamo, which was actually a dark comedy, believe it or not. And just sort of put that aside. We had the pandemic, and then we came back to it again. And when we came back to it in 2022, I think it was, actually enough time had passed that people would start talking to us, like on the record finally. So that's when we realized we could actually do this thing. And yeah, we'll talk about the weirdness and all the rest of it. But yeah, it was a challenge.
Bo Bergdahl, who was released in a prisoner swap for men at Guantanamo, right?
Yes,
so that you couldn't escape.
We try to keep all our seasons sort of, yeah.
Yeah. So on the weirdness, right? A few minutes into the first episode, which I understand I think was your visit to Guantanamo in 2015, you talk about standing up on a bluff, looking out over what is legitimately like a beautiful landscape ocean in Guantanamo, and you say, and what you said is not one of your most eloquent moments. I think it's entirely correct and appropriate for those of us who have been there. The fucked upness is getting to my head.
Yeah.
So what was the sort of most surprising thing about doing the series? What impacted you most?
Maybe I should give some background on the fucked upness is going to my head. When we were there on that trip, we sort of were on a media tour of the prison facilities, and we were with this group of very chipper, nice, friendly PAOs, public affairs officers, and everything was sort of like friendly and copacetic on its face, but nobody would answer our questions ever, and it was kind of driving us mad. And it was also Cuba in May, and it was so hot, and we were just driving off somewhere, and we were passing Camp Iguana, which was this small facility where they housed the child prisoners, and eventually the Uyghur prisoners, and a couple other people on their way to being released. And it's what I learned later from Carol Rosenberg is this building is actually like it's like a beach hut that people who are stationed at Guantanamo can rent for their families for the weekend, because it is on a cliff overlooking the Caribbean by one of the nicer beaches. And they had just taken it and turned it into a prison for children, basically. And it was Camp Iguana. And we were driving past it, and I said, can we just stop? I'd like to take a picture of it. And as soon as we stopped, this Humvee showed up with MPs. And it was because we'd stopped, and it wasn't on anybody's tour list that we were gonna make this stop so I could snap a picture of the doorbell. And so we were stopped there for half an hour or something, and I think our PAO got in trouble for it. And so that was when I said to Sarah, I was just sort of losing it, the fucked upness is going to my head. So that was that little scene. It was maybe even just day 2 of being there. But I'm sorry, I forgot what your actual question was.
No, in perfect Guantanamo fashion.
And I'm not going to answer it.
We're all done, folks. Thanks for coming. Anything in particular that I know a lot of things stood out, right? You covered a gigantic amount in the podcast, and actually listening back to it again, I realized you covered even more than I thought the first time around. But were there particular things, an interview with somebody, something you saw, right, something you heard that really either jumped out at you or left an impact on you, I think for both you and Jessica?
At Guantanamo specifically, or just in general?
Just doing the whole series.
I gotta, actually being at Guantanamo is such a weird experience, and it is so hard to articulate to people what the weirdness is and the sort of ick that you feel when you leave. And I think that was the thing that has really stuck with me. And I think we tried very hard, especially in the first episode, to sort of articulate that and present that in a way that you could kind of understand. But that for me, there's plenty of interviews that were totally fascinating and all the rest, but that was the feeling that has stuck with me. And this is sort of a cliche of Guantanamo at this point, but you go and you're on an American military base, so it's like an American town, and there's a McDonald's and there's a Subway and there's a putt-putt golf course with a little guard tower hole, and the paintball range is called the Ground Zero Paintball Range. It's just it's a town. And it's a company town, and we say this, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself from episode 1, but it is that feeling of it's a military base, so there are people that are going about their day doing their job, and they should, and it's beautiful, and they can, anybody can go scuba diving, you can go snorkeling, whatever. And then at the same time, there's this extrajudicial prison that's on the back 40. That's just sitting there, and kind of nobody really wants to talk about it, but you're that's why we're all here. And the disconnect of that, and the feeling of nobody will address the reality it's crazy making. And so that for me was what stuck with me the most.
Guantanamo's slogan, safe, humane, lawful, transparent.
Transparent, yeah. Yes.
I
think they dropped the transparent now.
How about for you, Jessica?
So much about Guantanamo and the reporting we did surprised me. But to summarize it, I think it it felt, I think one kind of bizarre comparison we made was that it reminded us of the TV show Lost.
Yeah.
Like it just was this hermetic world. And when you were in it, it was this sort of alternate reality. And it was always interesting to me to talk to people who had left Guantanamo and had just completely left it behind them. There was an interview I did with a translator that didn't make the series. And she was so bright, and she spoke all these languages, and we were talking about her experience at Guantanamo, and then like an hour into the conversation, she was like, "Is it still open?" And I was like, yeah, but I totally understood the instinct to just leave that behind, and it felt very familiar with a lot of the other people I'd spoken to, and of course, the ability of personnel to leave it behind is very different than the ability of detainees to leave it behind. And that duality was very striking as we went through the reporting of talking to both personnel and former detainees. Just that it was, I think the other thing that surprised me is that, the series includes episodes about personnel, about detainees, about victims of the families of victims of September 11th. We tried to sort of get a kaleidoscopic perspective on the place from all the people it affected. And I think I was really struck by how and not to equate the experiences of those different people, but I was struck by how traumatized the personnel were. Like that, the consistency of that was surprising to me.
Yeah, Alan, you and I have talked about a thread that I think sort of runs through that in a somewhat similar way.
Yeah, exactly. When I listened to the whole podcast, what I was struck by was this across the board, no matter who the person was, this whole kind of, and it's even hard to like completely describe, but I would put it in the category of ambiguity. That like when you would ask, like what was the worst part, or what was hard for you, it seemed like guard, prisoner, 9/11 family member, what people talked about was, what are the rules, what is happening, when is this gonna end, when is there gonna be a trial, what is the purpose of this, and like nobody really knowing that and having a really hard time making sense of it. We have actually a clip that starts with guard, then prisoner, then Sarah talking about one of the 9/11 family members that I think gets to that. So should we play that and then make a couple comments after that?
When they had first deployed to Guantanamo, Raul was a cheerful, confident guy, a model soldier. By the time he left,
I came away thinking that I was a piece of shit.
a few months after he got home, Raul says he had a panic attack and eventually got a diagnosis of PTSD from Afghanistan and Guantanamo.
So I was trained for Afghanistan. I was trained for Kosovo. You cannot train for Guantanamo Bay.
One of the reasons why Majid wanted me to understand his respect for the CIA was so I would understand how he felt about his treatment at Guantanamo, to contrast it. Because for Majid, his time in Camp 7 was worse. He wasn't being interrogated anymore. Sometimes the FBI would pay him a visit, ask him some questions, but that's it. So the cruelty at Guantanamo had no purpose.
CIA torture was like, surgical. Okay, for a few hours, a few months, or whatever they're trying to. There's a reason behind it. It's like they're doing it. I get it, why they're doing it. There was no justification of what they did in Camp 7. Zero.
Waiting 20 years for a trial doesn't just deny Colleen answers. Year after year after year, it prolongs her grief, makes dealing with her brother's death harder, if such a thing is possible.
So there's this psychological theory coined by someone named Pauline Boss, who happens to be from Minnesota, which is where I'm from, which talks about a loss that isn't clear. And when she originally sort of talked about this theory, she talked about sort of two things, like the situation where somebody is physically present but psychologically absent. So this is like somebody who has Alzheimer's. They're there in front of you, but they're not the same person that they were. Or the reverse, where they're psychologically present but physically absent. So this is like a kidnapped child or a disappeared soldier. And I really think this concept sort of fits well with all of this, because when you can't find meaning in something, when it doesn't make sense, it makes it really difficult to move on and can, result in prolonged grief. And in listening to all of the episodes, that's sort of what I heard. And like we talked about this with what we just heard, you heard Majid Khan say, no, was it Majid? Yeah, it was Majid Khan say, like, the torture made sense, which torture doesn't make sense, right? Like when you think about it. But to him, it had some sense of purpose and meaning. And then what happened at Guantanamo, like, didn't make any sense at all, and that seemed to be sort of where he was stuck.
Yeah, and I think with this really surprised us when he said it to us. He said it multiple times, and we talked about it because we were sort of like, how do we understand this? And I remember one of the things you said was torture doesn't make sense. Like you can't make sense of it. But yeah, for him, I think in the CIA black sites, he could see it as a sort of, these are my opponents, and this is a game we're playing. They're trying to get information from me, and I'm trying to keep it in. So there was a purpose to it. But at Guantanamo, it was random, and he described it as just cruelty for the sake of cruelty. Like, there was no reason. It was just to be cruel. And he struggled with that way more than what he endured in the black sites, which was awful. Yeah.
For those not familiar with Majid Khan's case, he's one of the few men who was charged in the military commission system, and his case actually went through finality. He ended up pleading guilty where the main charge was facilitating a $50,000 towards the men who were alleged to have bombed the JW Marriott Hotel in Indonesia in 2003, so not connected to 9/11. He was captured in 2003, sent to a CIA black site for 3 years. He was able to, as part of his plea agreement, tell his story in a public, I use air quotes because it's at Guantanamo, at the military commissions, it's only so public, to a military jury. And it was, I'm not going to try to describe his statement. It's one of the hardest things. I was there when he read the statement. It's one of the hardest things I've ever heard someone read. It's available on the Center for Constitutional Rights website. But he does in that statement similarly say, well, I endured this absolutely unconscionable, horrendous treatment in CIA custody. I mean, things like being raped with a garden hose. Guantanamo was like death by 1,000 cuts. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't make sense of it. And for that reason, I think this, as he said to you, in some ways worse. And while we're on his sort of story, one thing I think, I've been doing this long enough with Guantanamo that there's a lot that doesn't surprise me anymore. I mean, the different ways in which cruelty can manifest. Sometimes you weren't expecting it, but it's not all that surprising. Sitting in the courtroom, I was next to his father and his sister, who he'd seen for the first time that morning in 19 years. Watching him walk in, and I am pretty sure make the heart symbol to his family, and then read that statement is something that I will absolutely never forget. The next morning after reading that statement, which he read to his military jury that had to sentence him because of a sort of formality in how the military commission system works, even though he had a plea deal already with a term of years, the jury went back to deliberate and came back in, and when you're watching the military commissions, you're behind a plate of glass that has a 40-second time delay. So like everybody's doing stuff and talking, and you don't get it until 40 seconds later, which is really bizarre. So we watched a letter get handed up to the judge, and all of the lawyers are like scrambling and making faces and talking to each other, and nobody has any idea on the outside what's going on. Well, it turned out that entirely unprompted, on a lined notebook paper, the jury foreman, along with every other juror except one, had written a handwritten note to the judge urging that Majid get clemency, and that what the U.S. did to him was morally repugnant, a constitutional violation, not who they are as military members. You don't see this almost ever, including in federal court, and I think it was, for me, it was a very powerful reminder of the way torture dehumanizes people, and when they are then human again in other people's eyes, what's been done to them is for anyone, right? I mean, a lot of this was perpetrated by, U.S. military and intelligence officers. They were absolutely adamant that it was not permissible. I want to switch a little in a second over to talking a little bit more about sort of the specifics of what happened at Guantanamo. But before we do, one other thing that continues to strike me to this day about Guantanamo is I can't remember who, and I really wish I could because I would credit them, but use the term malevolence exacerbated by incompetence. And it is really so descriptive of Guantanamo, right? So like a couple examples, Guantanamo's medical care system has always been atrocious. I mean, it's not surprising, like the place was not set up to be around for 20 plus years. We did an entire report at CBT on it, working with independent medical experts, one of whom I think is here. But things like, there were men who would need an MRI because they have significant brain trauma because they were smashed against a wall over and over because that was one of the interrogation techniques. And so Guantanamo gets an MRI and they just leave it outside. And then like 3 months later they need it, and in a shocking turn of events it's broken because it's been sitting outside in Cuba for months. They order a new one and it gets shipped to the wrong military base. Right. Similarly, there was an actual CIA black site at one time at Guantanamo, which then ended, but it still sits on the rest of the, sort of in the detention facility. They used to have independent medical experts, the few who were allowed down there, meet with men to talk through their medical issues at that black site without realizing, oh, that was a former black site. Maybe it's a problem that this person was tortured here and now is supposed to submit to a medical exam here. And then there's like some of the, and I promise I'll stop in a minute, but it's very hard, right? With the like Inspector Clouseau type stuff, like listening devices in attorney-client meeting rooms that get discovered because one of the defense attorneys just unscrews the light plate and it's like sitting there. One of the cases in the military commissions, so the prosecution of the military commissions is made up of military members and Justice Department lawyers. The Justice Department has a significant hand in the commissions. The judge in the case, without telling anybody, and the prosecutors eventually lying about it, was applying for a job at DOJ to be an immigration judge at the same time he was sitting on the case that DOJ lawyers were prosecuting, right? About as obvious a conflict of interest as you can get. And he used one of his pro-government rulings as a writing sample. And of course, this gets found out. It goes up to a federal court, like a real court, and it wiped out 3 years worth of the entire case history, all of the rulings, all of the motions, et cetera, and it had to go back 3 years and start again. So like these are the kinds of things that you, in some ways you are surprising, but you come to expect from Guantanamo. Okay, let's maybe shift and talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of the abuses that happened there, because I do think there's been more public discussion or maybe press around CIA torture, around Abu Ghraib, though Abu Ghraib came directly from Guantanamo. All of that, save for a technique or two, was also done at Guantanamo by the military. There was a real coordination between the CIA and the military there, including the chief counsel for a group called the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA, who went to Guantanamo to meet with staff there who were doing interrogations, and in explaining how to do them, ended up being quoted in a way that became public, saying, if the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong. So that's the kind of thing that many of these men who were there went through. Ali, can you talk a little bit about the impact of that kind of abuse, both on the people it's perpetrated and sort of how somebody can become a torturer, how somebody could end up in the role of perpetrating that kind of abuse?
Well, so like I said in the beginning, I've been at CBT for a really long time now. And one of the conclusions I think I've come to after being at CBT for so long is that I really believe that given the wrong social circumstance, any one of us could be tortured and any one of us could be a torturer. And also, this is the reason why like people try to get away from me at parties, because it's the kind of thing. And I mean, I think this is the thing, like it would be, in some ways it's really nice and it would be so much easier if there were heroes and villains, or, you know, like if things were black and white, good and bad. And it's just not that simple. It's just this whole world of gray, I think.
You both, at least between you, talked to both, right? You talked to survivors and you talked to perpetrators. What was that like?
I think that an interview that really sticks with me, or like something that came up a lot talking to detainees that sticks with me, is like the hardest thing was just not knowing when you were going to get out. And there's this one story that didn't make it into the podcast, but it was towards the end of the Obama administration. The detainees got lots and lots of cardboard, and they started making a lot of structures out of cardboard. Some of them were art projects, some of them were furniture, and it was like a really immersive effort. And they made trees, and they made boats, and they made big projects. And I was talking to one of the detainees who was making these cardboard projects, and he was like, yeah, they just were doing anything to try to make us not realize that they weren't gonna tell us we were gonna get out. And the pain of that, and just that in and of itself being an abuse, was something that really stuck out to me talking to the detainees. And then talking to the personnel, it's what you were saying before really, what you were both saying before, I think talking to people who were there, especially when Guantanamo opened, and were just in the kind of fever pitch of post 9/11 and vulnerable and scared and being told a very specific narrative about what was happening in Guantanamo and how they were serving their country. And then gradually realizing that the narrative wasn't as clear as that. There's one person who's interviewed in episode 1 who was like, yeah, I really quickly realized like that guy doesn't know anything. And that realization and coming to terms with this feeling of the world, that the rules of the world not being clear to you, and that the people who are supposed to be in charge are not being fully honest with you, and how challenging that was.
How about for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's what Jessica said. Like what we heard from former detainees was the hardest part was not knowing if and when they were going to get out. I remember I interviewed this guy, Omar DeGaius, who was there very early, and he got beat up a bunch, in part because his strategy was to fight back. But he got beat up in some really awful ways, and I asked him what was the scariest thing for you, and he said just not knowing was the hardest thing. It's interesting because, as I recall, like one of the things that Majid told me about being in the CIA black sites was the hardest times were the times when he was not being tortured, because he was just on edge waiting to hear a key clank, that means they're coming to get me now. Is that guy next door getting tortured? Like, that space of not knowing was far worse than when he was actually being tortured. So the psychological torture of all of it was, from everyone we talked to, was much harder to handle than the physical. And you know, like, to your point about, you know, anyone can be a torturer, it was super interesting interviewing this guy, Mr. X, who is in episode 2, and he participated in the torture of Mohamedou Salahi, who's sort of one of the more famous former detainees. And it's fascinating talking to him because he was sure that he was the good guy when he was there, and he was doing the right thing. And, you know, he dressed up in this costume to look as scary as possible, sort of like Hollywood scary, to try to scare the crap out of Mohamedou, and participated in a mock rendition of him, where they sort of like kidnapped Mohamedou and put him in a boat and drove him around the bay. And he left, he came sort of like, so he started being like, we're the good guys, obviously, and came, you know, completely around to the other side, and now lives with this terrible like guilt of what he did, and you know, it doesn't sort of absolve him of the things he did to Mohamedou and others, and he will say that, but he has come sort of around to the other side and is appalled at what he's done. So yeah, I don't, you know, not everybody can have that realization or does have that realization, but it was interesting talking to him because he could speak from both sides of it.
Can we talk about that whole, what you just described for a minute? Because this was another interesting thing that you and I ended up talking about. So in this, I don't know what you call it, exercise, mock rendition, so they put Slahi in a boat in Cuba, right, and drove him around. And this is the second episode. And you called me because there was this exchange that you had with both of them where Slahi says, I was in this, well, actually, we have a clip of it. Let's play that clip and then talk about it.
Slahi's arms were pinned to his sides under a life preserver, almost like he was in a straitjacket. He had blackout goggles on, earmuffs, shackles. His ribs were injured, possibly broken. His face was busted up. And then
they kept open my mouth. They raised my mouth, and they put pouring water until I feel like I'm all like drowned under the water. And then they stop. And then I start choking. It's like salt water. It's not real water. It's not regular water.
Slahi says there were two people handling him.
One was holding my head, one was pouring the water. So,
Mr. X disputes some of what Slahi says happened. He says yes, they did make him drink water, but just to keep him hydrated, and it wasn't salt water. He thinks Slahi smelled the salty air and felt the sea spray and got confused. Slahi says no, he was not confused. It was salt water.
Okay, so when we talked about this, as a trauma therapist, as you were explaining this whole thing to me, I was like, this absolutely makes perfect sense. Because in the middle of a trauma event, what happens in the brain is that the part of the brain that is processing like the order of events or exactly what's happening is flooded with stress hormones and is inhibited. But the part of the brain that has all of these sensory experiences and the feelings that go along with it, the amygdala, keeps on running. So like we don't know really what happened, right? Like we don't know if it was actual salt water or if it was water, but from my perspective, it doesn't matter because that was his experience. And there likely was some kind of salt element. Maybe the Mr. X guy was telling the truth, maybe he was lying, who knows? But to me, like in a therapeutic setting, it doesn't matter. But to you all as reporters with like fact checkers and the whole thing, it does. So I don't know if you could say anything about like what that experience is like from where you sit.
I mean, that's like one of the many things that you just can't get to the bottom of in these stories. And so we just say, we did what you guys just heard. Mamadou says this happened to him. Mr. X says, absolutely not. I would never have done that. We will never know, I think. We'll never know. I'm guessing it wasn't documented anywhere either. So it's not even just like there's a document we could ask for and they could say no. But yeah, to your point, like I think the reason we included it was because to Mamadou it was such a visceral memory of that moment, and an important one to him. So whether it was saltwater or not, does it matter? I don't know. Right. It happened to him. Mr. X says he was giving him water to hydrate him, but yeah, I believe that the experience was terrifying. Like the whole experience was terrifying. So even if he was drinking water or having salt water poured on him, it was terrifying either way. Yeah.
You obviously have deep clinical expertise, right, in the kind of the way that torture affects memory and the brain, and so that recollection might not be what it is for the rest of us chronological. It might be spotty. It might be based on some particular item, et cetera, that might bring back memories. Which is partly why science has shown for decades that information produced by torture is not reliable. There's another component to that too, which I think the episode 2 does a great job of demonstrating. I'm pretty sure it's episode 2. Yeah. That the other reason information obtained through torture isn't reliable, and why all legitimate court systems around the world prohibit using it, is that people will say anything to stop the pain. And we have a clip on this that would be great if we can run.
It worked very, very well. All I can say is this. Everybody on the team got a Defense Meritorious Service Medal. It's a high award in the American military. In that citation, it refers to the single most important source of information on Al-Qaeda in Europe. So I think it played out very well.
I admit that I am as guilty as any other participants, and I am so sorry and ashamed for what I have done. Signed, Muhammad Rasulullah.
How much of that is true?
None of it is true.
So this was after that rendition thing with Slahi, and after this happened, as you talk about in the episode, he starts writing reams and reams and reams of things about everything that happened. And then they win an award for it or whatever else, and he says that none of it is true. And this exactly resonates with what clients have been telling us for years and years and years, that their torturers already knew the information, that they had them just sign something that was already written, that people would say anything just to make it stop. And the example I always think of is former Senator John McCain in Vietnam. He talked a lot about lying under torture, and one of the things he sort of famously talked about is they wanted to know like the members of his platoon, and he gave the then roster of the Green Bay Packers. And it made the torturers stop.
So I think this may be a good transition. I know we want to start taking some questions in a minute, and there's one here I think that this will flow into. But to maybe close the loop on Slahi's case in particular, the Army colonel who was then assigned to prosecute him refused. And he said, I'm not going to prosecute somebody that our military treated this way, and B, I have no credible evidence to prosecute him because everything that you've given me that he's said is not admissible in court. And that has been a problem endemic throughout the military commissions. And this is sort of goes back to the beginning, right? Guantanamo was not set up with the idea of prosecuting these men. It was set up to hold them indefinitely, to torture them, and I think in many ways as much out of revenge as any kind of an information gathering exercise. So those who have been charged in the military commissions, and of that 780 people, it's in the low 30s, and 12-ish of those, the charges were entirely dismissed and those men were transferred. There have been a handful, 9, 10 convictions, maybe up to 11 now, in the convictions. Almost all, there's been one full trial on a conviction in the commission. Everything else has been by plea agreement, and most of those plea agreements until recently, federal courts overturned in either whole or in part for a whole host of different reasons. The 9/11 case is also still in pretrial proceedings 17 years later, in large part because of this. Like, the key evidence against the men is information they gave while being tortured at CIA black site, and that was basically handed over to the FBI to reverse engineer through questioning 3 years later when they were sent to Guantanamo, and then the government is trying to use that. All of this is you all cover in the last episode of the podcast. And so maybe we'll kick off the questions with, I think, a good one, which is why, or you could have told the story of the 9/11 case in a lot of different ways. You tell it through the eyes of Peaceful Tomorrow's colleagues. Like, why did you choose to do it that way?
I saw Colleen speak during a congressional hearing, and I was so moved, honestly, by her testimony. And I think I think for our job, like the key is to find an emotional through line through the story. And when I saw Colleen speak, I was just like, this is an emotional through line through this story. And then she and all of Peaceful Tomorrows very generously gave us access to their group and their conversations for 2 years. And sitting in on those conversations for 2 years was honestly a pleasure. They're just very lovely people, very thoughtful people. And then I think I will also say that one of the most remarkable things about Peaceful Tomorrows and about Colleen is that for very understandable reasons, like there's not a lot of 9/11 families who are as invested as they are. They are a representative of Peaceful Tomorrows is basically at every hearing. They're talking to representatives. They're so actively involved in this. And we really couldn't find any other family group or victim advocacy group that was nearly on the front lines like that. We tried because of course Peaceful Tomorrows has a point of view politically, and we wanted to make sure we wanted to present all points of view in the story, but because they were so active and they were so invested in what they call judicial finality, it just made sense to follow it through them because they knew so much. So those were the reasons.
Yeah, I mean, they've had a representative at every single hearing of the 9/11 case since it was charged. I mean, they're right. Nobody else is on top of it. I mean, I follow it closely, and I'm not remotely that in the weeds.
Yeah, they are in the weeds. There's a scene in that episode which I love, which is Sarah's taking a tour through Colleen's house, and she's just like, "Whoa, what is this?" And it's like a big sheet of paper on the back of Colleen's door that's just explaining the commissions, and it's just like that is how close she is to this case, that it's in her bedroom. Like, one of the most useful documents we found about the military commissions hangs on the back door of Kelly's bedroom. So it was very obvious that we were dealing with a very special person who just had an incredible level of knowledge of this very convoluted, very complicated, very long, very important case.
Having worked with them now for a very long time, I think one of the things that's very frustrating for them, and I think I'm on safe ground saying this, and for many of us who want to see an end to the 9/11 case, is that I think it is more than reasonable for different people to have different views on how this trial should shake out, right? I think it's entirely understandable, wherever one stands on capital punishment or not, to feel like this was the worst terrorist attack in US history, and there should have been a trial, it should have been quick, it should have been fair, and there should have been a capital sentence. And that was probably realistic, right, had the case been sent to federal court. But we're so far down the line now, and it's broken in so many ways, and people like Colleen and Terry have been watching it break time after time after time after time. And it's why they've ended up, as I think the episode covers really well, supporting a plea agreement in the case, because the options now are a plea agreement or status quo. Right? There is no, we will have a full contested trial, there will be a sentence, there will be a death penalty, it will survive through the federal, it just doesn't exist anymore as a realistic possibility. And I think it can be hard. They know so much, and we've seen this over the last couple weeks with some members of Congress who like to opine on this and don't know anything about it, who say, well, this is ridiculous, there has to be the death penalty. And I think you have this group sitting here like, sure, even if that's what you believe in, but it just isn't an option anymore. And it's a really sad, right, commentary. Okay, we have time for one more question, is that right? I can't. Two. Okay. All right, we got a couple. So we have I think another good one. What was the biggest challenge in doing the series? And then maybe a sort of a sub question on that, like how did you overcome the people not wanting to talk beyond just the passage of time since you started it in 2015?
We're both looking at each other.
I mean, the biggest challenge was people not wanting to talk and like running up against the government bureaucracy that doesn't really want to let any information out, and the sort of like layers of historical reticence to allow information to leave that place, and that's like the number one, I think, challenge, on top of just like trying to understand what the hell is happening in this like made up legal system that is just sort of happening there kind of constantly. So those are the two biggest challenges, I think. And honestly, getting people to talk was mainly a matter of time and of them leaving the military, and being able to talk, because they really can't talk when they're still in the military. So that's like a lot of the time thing was like people retiring from the military and then being like, okay, now I can tell you what I actually thought back then. So that was it.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the episode 3 and 4 is about the case of a translator who was accused of espionage, and he was not a spy. And the case, he had never told his story in full. And he was just finally ready in a way that we just got him at, I think honestly it was just patience. I think patience is the key to getting people to talk. Just like waiting until they're ready and then being there when they are. And yeah, getting people to talk was definitely one of the biggest challenges with the series. I would say the other biggest challenge was getting people to care. Like, I think we talked a lot about that, like making the show, like people hear. Yeah, because it's like you hear Guantanamo, and a lot of people are like, oh, that history, like, and there's, we're in a busy news cycle, and there's how many people there, and that's not that many people. Isn't there other things we should be focusing on? And so we had a lot of internal conversations about how to structure the series, how to position the series, how to sell the series in a way that could get people to listen and to care.
On that topic of getting people to talk, I actually was quite surprised of the people that you did have talk, how much they shared. in ways that I wonder, like going back to that whole, like, what is the meaning of all of this? I wonder if for some of them it ended up being sort of a cathartic thing, that you actually sort of helped, not intentionally necessarily, but sort of helped them through all of this by getting a chance to talk about it.
Yeah, certainly a few of them have said that, you know, and like some of them we just went back to again and again over, because we did this for 2.5 years, this podcast, and Sarah and I had also done reporting for the TV show and in 2015, and so like a lot of these people we went to over and over again over the years, and it's asking a lot of them, and they were all, I think, very patient with us. But yeah, a lot of them said afterwards, this has been really helpful. Raul, who's in the first episode, who was our PAO, one of our PAOs when we were there in 2015, and then he left, and then he was like, let me tell you what I was really thinking. One of the many interviews I did with him, he said to me, he was like, I never ever talk about Guantanamo with anyone. He was like, I don't even talk to my therapist about it. And he's like, I only talk to you about it. And I was like, yeah, it's a weird sort of, people don't get it, I think. And a lot of the personnel who work there leave and like had this kind of awful experience, but there's nobody to talk to about it because nobody gets it. And they're like, what's the big deal? You're on a Caribbean island. You were like boozing your head off for 9 months. Like, I don't see the problem. And it's hard to articulate what the problem is because you weren't in a war zone. And, you know, like, so you know, I think people did appreciate it that way.
One of the things that was on our cutting room floor that I have some sadness about is there's a clip of Dana and a former detainee driving somewhere, Danny, and they were just talking about Guantanamo, and he goes, we have so much gossip. And it was just like he's one of 2 former detainees that lives in the country where he was relocated to. He doesn't have a lot of people to talk about this experience with. And then he was on like a road trip with Dana, and it felt, I think, comforting for someone who like—
The weirdest road trip I've been on.
And like in the clip, they're like, yeah, we have gossip. And it was, but I think it spoke to this kind of, if not like being seen in a way by someone really knowing where he lives in a country where no one knows anything about Guantanamo, and Dana was there, and she did, and she had questions.
Man, we gossiped a lot.
So actually, apropos of one of the questions, how do you decide what ends up on the cutting room floor versus what goes into the podcast? You have 90 seconds, go.
The answer to that question is a complicated one. We have a very, I would say, like, we really pride ourselves on an editorial process at Serial, which is adopted from an editorial process of This American Life. It is where every episode we read out loud, and usually we read out loud and play the tape, and it's like a table read of the episode, and then we tear it apart. And you know, I think that I think we make these shows so that people listen to them. You know, like that's our job, to make things people want to listen to. And so we take the editing process really seriously. And so when people listen to drafts of the episodes, say, I drifted here, I didn't understand this, we cut it and we change it. And I think as hard as that process is, I think we take a lot of pride in the end of being like, we are only giving you our best material, even though the process for that was very hard. And we lost things that we cared a lot about in the process. So that's my non-answer to your question.
That's the right answer. It's the right answer, yeah.
I feel like we'd be remiss if we did this and didn't mention Carol
Yes,
at some point.
thank
So
you.
Carol Rosenberg, who's the intrepid New York Times reporter who knows more about Guantanamo than pretty much anyone else has forgotten, even who's worked on this sort of forever. There's an episode about her. One of my favorite Carol stories, going back to your point about how it's kind of impossible to know what's happening at Guantanamo, including for the people who are working there. The Government Accountability Office, which is kind of like a broad federal watchdog audit agency, did a sort of investigation report on the military commissions, and they were looking at how much do they cost, how transparent are they, how do they run, et cetera. And when GAO is how it's referred to, when GAO does these kind of things with executive branch agencies, people are very careful in government about what they say. Right? Because it's all on the record. It all ends up going into the recommendations that GAO makes. And GAO met with people at Guantanamo and got 3 people to say to them, the question was, like, how do you know what's coming up in the military commissions? Like, there's a website, right? It has a website. It's supposed to have all the filings and all the dates. Do you follow that regularly? And to a person, all 3 said, no, we don't look at that. And they sort of asked, well, how do you know what's happening? They said, we look at Carol Rosenberg's Twitter feed. It's in the report saying a reporter's Twitter feed. It's very clear who it is. And one of the questions actually we have is if you all work with Carol beyond the podcast, or what it was like to do the episode with her for the podcast.
Playing the episode for her was one of the most scared I've ever been in my entire life. Like, Sarah later made fun of me because she was like, your knees were against your chest. You were like holding yourself in. I was so nervous about how she was going to react. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of admiration for Carol, so I was very nervous. And also, like, being the subject of journalism when you are a journalist, it just must be so stressful and so intimidating. And I know, as all journalists, you never want to be the story. So I know that she took a big risk in letting us do that. And so I was just very nervous to hear her reaction. Serial's a New York Times company now, so we're colleagues. I haven't had a chance to work with her much beyond that episode, but whenever she's in town, it's a delight to see her.
Carol's now, I think, after this latest transfer, she is, right, the person who has actually been there the longest?
Yes,
right?
I believe that is.
So, like, Carol was at Guantanamo before any of actually, she already was. She was there before the first prisoners arrived, like a day or 2 before. And she has been there ever since, like, nonstop. And she literally knows everything about the place. She is the institutional knowledge of Guantanamo, is this one, like, intrepid reporter, Carol Rosenberg. And literally, like, when we would go and ask the people who are our public affairs officers who are supposed to answer our questions a question, if they didn't know, they would say, ask Carol. And so she is the institutional knowledge of the place. And she was so generous with us, with that knowledge, and supportive of this project, and, you know, helping us get through edits and telling us you should talk to this guy in Florida, or, you know, you got this fact wrong, or whatever. But in just this spirit of generosity and collegiality, and yeah, I don't know, she's the best. I can't say enough good words about Carol Rosenberg. She's a national treasure. She actually is.
Agreed.
She really is. Yeah.
Actually is. Okay, we're going to close on this one quickly, and I thought this was phrased very well. How does this all end? I'm curious what I mean, I am so deep into this that it's like a 4-hour answer. So I'm curious what you all see going forward, and then I'll.
This being Guantanamo?
Jump in. This being Guantanamo.
Jess, you want to take that one?
I was hoping you would. I think if, honestly, my first thing is like, well, Carol said that. So I could tell you some things that Carol said about it. It seems like at this point there's not that many people there. And then, the numbers could continue to dwindle in the weeks ahead. We'll see. And then what it becomes really, I think, depends on what happens to the plea deal. And it was very interesting to me, and we talked about this a lot, just that that as part of the plea deal, a big question about it was whether the men who were tortured in CIA custody would receive torture treatment as part of the plea deal, and that whether Guantanamo was able to provide that. And I don't know. I don't know whether that's the future, but that's very interesting to me that that's even a possibility that people are discussing. That this place could turn into a space where rehabilitation for torture is offered to people. But I don't know if that's going to happen, of course. But it seems like it's kind of just the trajectory of Guantanamo seems. There's a quote in episode 1 from an intel analyst named Jake who loved Guantanamo, he was an intel analyst who loved it when he first got there. And then he came back in 2015, or then he was like, and the question I had is, why are we all still here? And I feel like that question just becomes more and more the story of the place as it moves forward in time.
We'll close with my very cynical view, unless Dana.
No, I agree with everything. I mean, I think it's a practical question too, because right, the 9/11 defendants are asking to stay. Is that right? So if that ended up being the deal, then it will end when they die. If that ends up being the plea deal ends up going through, and that's the deal, then that's the answer.
I do think there's a way they could be there and it not be everything that Guantanamo has been and represents from the beginning, but that's not the path, I think, that sadly, at least as of tonight, that we're on. I was optimistic this administration would close it. It will not get there now by January 20th, absent something absolutely extraordinary. The plea deal now is, for the government, the best it will ever get. The current agreement contains none of those assurances, no condition, right? I mean, you know all this, but it's no, the defendants are asked for no solitary confinement, commit not to transferring us to some other black site, let us practice our religion, like very basic humane treatment standards. Government said no. They ended up getting a plea deal anyway. It's basically a life sentence for nothing on the other side, except pleading guilty. And it looks, as of tonight at least, like that is not going to go forward tomorrow. So I fear that we are going to have, though it's only, a handful of, at this point, people left, that all of those people are going to be there for a very long time. Simon, I know you want to come back up and say a few words, but could we do a quick thank you to Sarah, to Jessica and Dana before we...
Actually, I'll go one better. Let's thank Scott, Ali, Dana, and Jessica. Let's thank all of them for that. I just got a text from Shelby, who's one of the organizers of this, basically telling me to sum up everything in about a minute. So we'll see how we go. I did want to say one thing, which is, listening to all the stories that we've heard tonight, it does remind me of what Dostoevsky wrote in the Book of the Dead, about that you can judge a society about it by the way that it treats its prisoners and by the kinds of prisons that it builds. And so I am one of these people that believe that a place like Guantanamo is a site that diminishes all of us. It's a moral stain on this country, but it's a moral stain on all of us. And the only way of, I think, erasing that stain is through accountability and justice for what's happened there over the last period, getting our humanity back to the center of this discussion, and standing up for universal human rights. So I might just leave it there and say, for those people online, we actually have some people online who are in California. If you're in California, I hope you're safe with the wildfires and everything's okay. For everyone who's here in New York in this room in the middle of a polar vortex, please go get home safely tonight and don't freeze along the way as well. But thank you again to our guests, to our speakers, and to everybody. That's it. Good night.